The rain hammered down in relentless sheets, flooding the streets of Chicago's industrial district. Steam curled up from a manhole cover, rising into the cold night air like ghostly tendrils, the moisture heavy in the atmosphere. James, a wiry black man in his late 40s, hunched under a makeshift shelter of cardboard and tarp beside an alley. His clothes were threadbare, sneakers barely clinging together, but his eyes, those eyes, held a quiet resilience that spoke volumes. Amidst the storm, something caught his attention. A sleek black car, its hazard lights flashing desperately, sat stranded just a block away. Even through the downpour, James could make out the figure of a man pacing beside it, phone pressed to his ear. He squinted, his breath forming a faint mist in the frigid air. Another broken-down rich guy, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But even as the words left him, something stirred inside him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He tugged his coat tighter, braced himself against the rain, and began trudging toward the car. As he drew closer, the man became clearer. Tall mid-30s, dressed in a sharp suit that practically screamed money. This wasn't just anyone. James recognized him from a billboard down the street. Ethan Walker, the tech mogul whose face was plastered across ads for a revolutionary new app. A local celebrity, though now he looked utterly out of place. Ethan noticed James approaching and instinctively stepped back, his eyes darting to the shadows, sizing up the stranger. "I've got a tow truck coming," he called out over the pouring rain. "I don't need any help." "Relax, man. I'm just trying to help," James replied, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. His voice was rough but steady. "Looks like a bad alternator. Won't go far unless you get it fixed." Ethan hesitated, his skepticism palpable. "You know cars?" he asked. James smirked, gesturing to the car with a slight nod. "Used to work in a shop for years. Before, well, life happened. I can take a look, save you waiting in this mess." Another beat of hesitation. Then Ethan relented with a reluctant nod. James crouched down beside the car, the rain dripping off his cap as he lifted the hood. His hands moved with surprising precision despite the cold. "Got a flashlight?" James asked without looking up. Ethan fumbled with his phone, holding it awkwardly above the engine. Within minutes, James had pinpointed the problem. He temporarily patched a connection and wiped his hands on his coat. "That'll hold for now," he said, standing up. "But you'll want to get it looked at proper tomorrow." Ethan stared at him, half shocked. "You actually fixed it?" James shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Doesn't take much. Just needed someone who knows their way around an engine." Reaching into his wallet, Ethan pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Here," he said, offering it. "Thank you." James shook his head, stepping back. "Keep it. Kindness doesn't come with a price tag." With that, he turned and began walking away, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had arrived. Ethan stood there, the rain now a forgotten nuisance, watching the retreating figure. For reasons he couldn't explain, a strange pang of guilt gnawed at him. The next morning, James awoke to the familiar sounds of the city coming to life. Car horns blared in the distance, and the murmur of commuters filled the air. He rubbed his hands together to chase away the lingering cold from a restless night spent under his coat. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger had long since become a dull ache, a constant companion. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, weaving through the usual downtown chaos, a man in a tailored gray suit appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. The stranger looked entirely out of place in this part of town, standing near a group of men waiting for their daily coffee handouts. The man's eyes scanned the crowd until they locked on James. "Are you James?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. James straightened, wary. "Who's asking?" The man extended a pristine white envelope, the kind James hadn't seen in years. There was something about it that screamed importance, something that made his heart race. "This is for you," the stranger said simply before turning and walking briskly away, leaving no time for questions. James stared at the envelope, hesitant. His gaze flicked around, half expecting someone to yell out, "Gotcha?" But no one paid him any mind. Slowly he slipped his finger under the seal and tore it open. Inside was a card, embossed with the name Ethan Walker. Beneath it, an address and a short message. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough. Please meet me here tomorrow at noon." James stood frozen, staring at the card as though it were written in a foreign language. Why would a guy like Ethan want to see him? His first instinct was to toss the card away. It had to be some kind of joke. But as the seconds passed, curiosity began to creep in. A strange sense of hope, too. The next day, James found himself standing outside a sleek high-rise in a part of town he usually avoided. The building's glass facade shimmered in the sunlight, its gleaming exterior a stark contrast to the gritty streets he knew so well. People in sharp suits moved in and out with purpose, their faces unreadable. James glanced down at his tattered clothes, his scuffed shoes, suddenly feeling small. Maybe this was a mistake, he muttered, turning to leave. But before he could take another step, a doorman approached him. "Are you Mr. James?" he asked, his voice surprisingly warm. James nodded, hesitant. "Mr. Walker is expecting you. Right this way." The doorman opened the grand glass doors, ushering James into a lobby that felt like another world. James followed in stunned silence, his heart pounding louder with each step. The elevator ride was smooth, almost surreal in its silence, and far too quick. Before he could catch his breath, it opened to the 25th floor, revealing a sprawling office bathed in natural light. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline, and sleek furniture filled the room, perfectly harmonized with the modern decor. James hesitated at the entrance, unsure if he should even step inside. Then a familiar voice broke his thoughts. "James." Ethan Walker approached, a warm smile replacing the frazzled expression James had seen the night before. Gone was the man pacing in the rain. This was a version of Ethan who exuded confidence and control. "Thanks for coming," Ethan said, extending a hand. James shook it cautiously, his rough, callous fingers meeting Ethan's smooth, manicured grip. "I wasn't sure if this was real," James admitted, his voice low. Ethan chuckled, his tone light. "I don't blame you. It's not every day someone like me shows up in someone else's world like this." He gestured toward a seating area. "Please sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" James waved off the offer and sank into a plush chair, its softness foreign to him. He glanced around, still unsure of what this was all about. Ethan sat across from him, leaning forward slightly. "Look, James," he began, his tone sincere. "I owe you an apology. Last night, I was rude to you, hesitant, even dismissive. And yet, you helped me without asking for anything in return. That stuck with me all night. I couldn't stop thinking about it." James shifted in his seat. The attention felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. James shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "It's no big deal." But Ethan wasn't having it. His voice was firm, unwavering, like a declaration of truth. "It is a big deal," he said, locking eyes with James. "You had nothing to gain, and you still did it. That kind of selflessness is rare. It made me realize something. I've been living in a bubble, surrounded by people who only care about what they can get from me. But you broke through that." Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out another envelope and handing it to James. James hesitated, fingers brushing against the cool paper. He opened it slowly, expecting another thank you note, but his eyes widened when he saw what lay inside: a check. His breath caught in his throat at the amount. $10,000. He pulled it away instinctively, pushing it back toward Ethan. "I can't take this," James said, his voice tight with disbelief. Ethan's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "You can, and you will," he insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But that's not all." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I want to offer you something more meaningful. A chance to rebuild." He leaned forward, eyes locking onto James's with a sincerity that felt almost tangible. "I'm starting a foundation to help people who've fallen through the cracks of society. People like you. And I want you to be part of it. Not just as someone we help, but as someone who helps others." James blinked, his mind scrambling to process what he was hearing. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Because you understand what it's like," he said simply. "You've lived it. You have insights and compassion that someone like me could never fully grasp. This foundation isn't about charity. It's about creating opportunities. And I think you'd be perfect to help shape it." For a long moment, James didn't know what to say. The room seemed to blur around him as emotions swirled. Disbelief, gratitude, and something more elusive, a cautious hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Ethan's voice broke through the fog. "Think about it," he said gently. "Take your time. But know this, you deserve it, James. You deserve a chance to turn things around." James left Ethan's office with the check in his hand, its weight almost unbearable. As he stepped onto the bustling city streets, everything felt different, less daunting, almost alive with possibility. But with the spark of hope came a creeping doubt. What if he failed? What if this was all too good to be true? The next few days passed in a blur of decisions made carefully, one step at a time. James used part of the money to buy a clean set of clothes, something he never thought he'd be able to afford. He booked a week at a modest motel, and, for the first time in years, took a long uninterrupted shower. The hot water soothed his tired muscles, washing away years of grime and exhaustion. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at a man he barely recognized. The day he returned to Ethan's office, James felt a mixture of nerves and determination. Ethan greeted him with that same warm smile. And without wasting time, he introduced James to the small but dedicated team behind the foundation. "This is just the beginning," Ethan explained as they walked through the office. "We're building everything from the ground up, but with your input, we'll make it something real. Something lasting." James met with case managers, grant writers, and outreach coordinators. They treated him with a level of respect he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he found himself sharing his story, his struggles, his pain, the moments that nearly broke him. And to his surprise, they listened. Really listened. Ethan's vision for the foundation was clear: to provide not just temporary aid, but sustainable paths to self-sufficiency. Job training programs, mental health support, and transitional housing were all on the agenda. And James, with his first-hand experience, was asked to help design some of these programs. "People don't just need money," James said one day during a brainstorming session. "They need someone to believe in them. That's what you gave me, Ethan. And that's what we've got to give others." James's own transformation unfolded alongside the foundation's growth. With Ethan's help, he rented a small studio apartment near the office. He started eating regularly. His gaunt frame slowly filled out. But the real change was deeper than appearances. One afternoon, Ethan walked into James's office, a broad grin spreading across his face. "You've got your first success story," he said, handing James a folder. James raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Ethan slid the folder toward him. "Andre," he said, his voice filled with pride. "A young man who'd been homeless for 2 years after aging out of the foster care system. He's coming in tomorrow. And I thought you might want to sit in on his intake meeting." The next day, James sat across from Andre, a wiry 20-year-old with guarded eyes. As the young man shared his story, James listened intently, nodding at all the right moments. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't offer empty promises. "I've been where you are," James said simply. "I know how hard it is to trust people when life's thrown you nothing but curveballs. But if you're willing to try, we'll meet you halfway. I'm living proof that it's possible to turn things around." Andre's skepticism softened. For the first time in a long while, James felt the rush of making a difference. Months passed, and James became an integral part of the foundation. What had started as a cautious step into the unknown had blossomed into a purpose-driven life. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to connect, uplift, and inspire. The foundation, now named the Turning Point Initiative, began making waves across the city, and James quickly became its beating heart. Word of his transformation spread beyond the local community. Reporters began taking notice, intrigued by the story of a man who had gone from sleeping on the streets to leading life-changing programs. James found himself interviewed on local news channels, his face and voice representing Ethan's mission. But the accolades and the cameras didn't matter. What mattered most to James were the people. Individuals like Andre, who once felt invisible, now starting to believe in themselves. He saw mothers reunited with their children, veterans finding stability, and young adults breaking the cycles of poverty. Each success reminded him of why he had chosen to stay. One afternoon, James visited an old stomping ground near the underpass where he used to sleep. The familiar faces were still there, some friendly, others hardened by time. He handed out flyers for the foundation, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. "I know it feels hopeless," he said to a small group of men and women. "I used to think the same thing. But there are people out there who care, who will fight for you, if you're ready to fight for yourself. I'm proof of that." One man, arms crossed, scoffed. "What makes you think anyone's gonna help me? People only care about themselves." James nodded, his gaze steady. "That's what I thought too. Until someone proved me wrong. Don't let pride or fear keep you where you are. If you're ready, we've got a place for you." Over the following weeks, a few from that group showed up at the foundation's doors. One by one, they began their own journeys toward stability, inspired by James's unwavering belief in the power of change. As the Turning Point Initiative blossomed, its reach spread far beyond the city's limits. Donations flooded in from all corners, driven by the powerful narrative of a millionaire and a homeless man whose serendipitous meeting had sparked a chain of events none could have predicted. Schools, churches, and local businesses rallied together, forming a web of support that lifted the entire community. Ethan often watched this transformation unfold, awe in his voice as he spoke to James. "You've become the face of hope," he remarked during one of their routine meetings. But James, ever humble, simply shook his head, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "I'm just paying it forward." You planted the seed. I'm just making sure it keeps growing. One evening, as James stood on the balcony of his modest apartment, the city before him seemed so different now. Once a place of harsh, unyielding streets, it now felt full of possibility. The low hum of traffic blended with the distant laughter of children playing below. And James couldn't help but think back to that rainy night. The night his entire life had pivoted with a single act of kindness. He was lost in these thoughts when his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Andre flashed on the screen. Got the job. Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you. James smiled, his chest swelling with a warmth he hadn't known in years. He quickly typed back. You did the hard part. Keep going. The city felt less daunting now, its skyline filled with promise. Though the world hadn't magically transformed, and the struggles didn't vanish overnight, James had found something more powerful than fear. A reason to keep moving forward. As the years passed, the Turning Point initiative began to make its mark. Not only on Chicago but in cities across the country, Ethan and James's partnership grew stronger, turning into something far more impactful than either had originally dreamed. Together, they expanded the foundation's reach, launching satellite programs in various states, and creating a roadmap for communities to tackle homelessness and systemic inequality. James, now in his early 50s, had evolved into a symbol of resilience and redemption. His once weathered face now carried a calm confidence, and his presence radiated authority, a quiet strength earned through years of struggle. But despite the changes, he remained grounded, never losing sight of the people he had once been. One summer, the foundation hosted its largest event yet, a grand fundraising gala at the Art Institute of Chicago. The guest list was star-studded, with celebrities, politicians, and philanthropists all eager to contribute to the cause. James, dressed in a tailored suit that still felt foreign yet somehow fitting, stood by Ethan's side, ready to address the crowd. Ethan spoke first, recounting their fateful meeting on that rainy night. If not for James, I'd probably still be stranded on the side of that road, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. What he gave me that night wasn't just help. It was perspective. And that's what the Turning Point initiative is all about. Helping people see the potential in themselves and in others. When it was James's turn, he took a deep breath, scanning the room full of influential faces. I used to think people like you didn't care about people like me, he began, his voice steady yet laced with emotion. But I learned that sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to bridge that gap. That's what we're doing here, building bridges. And I hope every single one of you leaves tonight inspired to build your own. The room erupted into applause, and the event raised a record-breaking amount of funds for the foundation. Back at ground level, the work continued to evolve. James spearheaded a mentorship program that paired those who had successfully transitioned out of homelessness with individuals just beginning their journey. It became one of his proudest accomplishments. Each year, he mentored several people personally. One of his ments, a young woman named Tasha, had fled an abusive relationship, taking her 2 children with her to safety, only to end up homeless. Through James's guidance and the foundation's resources, Tasha secured housing, enrolled in a job training program, and against all odds, became a caseworker herself. At her graduation ceremony, she hugged James tightly, tears streaming down her face. You gave me my life back, she whispered. James shook his head with a soft smile. You took it back. I just reminded you that you could. One day, as James walked through the foundation's bustling headquarters, a young man approached him hesitantly. His clothes were worn, his posture uncertain, but his eyes held a flicker of determination. Mr. James, the young man said, his voice trembling slightly. I heard your story. I want to try. I don't want to be out there anymore. James smiled and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've already taken the hardest step, just by walking through these doors. Let's figure out the rest together. That moment reminded James of the night he had first met Ethan. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect plans. It was about showing up, offering a hand, and believing in the power of change. Standing in the foundation's lobby that evening, watching staff and clients come and go, James felt a deep peace wash over him. Outside, the rain pattered gently against the windows, echoing the stormy night that had changed everything. He thought back to Ethan's words, "You deserve it." At the time, he hadn't believed them. But now, seeing the lives that have been transformed, and the hope rekindled in so many, James finally understood. It was never about deserving it. It was about deciding to give, to trust, and to take a chance on something better. As the rain continued to fall, James knew he would keep building those bridges, one act of kindness at a time.